Hi, thank you for watching this video. My name's Lee Thurburn. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe, click the like button, and post a comment. I look forward to hearing from you. In his State of the Union address on January 29, 2002, after 9/11, President George W. Bush branded North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as an axis of evil. He was right, and now the axis of evil has grown. I recently watched a series of videos by Dr. Jeffrey Sachs and Dr. Richard Wolff, where each discussed the rise and fall of capitalism and the influence of the Western world on a global stage. Both had similar, while subtly different, takes on their logic, but both concluded that the Western world in general, and the United States in particular, are suffering a declining level of influence on the world stage. They generally both agree that the U.S. in particular has been the fortunate beneficiary of a series of fortuitous historical circumstances that has now passed. They argue that our economy and our influence are presently in decline. Sachs in particular goes on to state that the current war in the Ukraine is the direct fault of the United States because the United States failed to engage in diplomacy with Putin, who after all really just wants to protect his people from a potential invasion by the NATO countries. NATO has of course been guilty of so many wars against its neighbors. Further, Sachs postulates that because the United States uses its economic and military muscle to influence other nations to do what the United States wants done, the United States is somehow not playing fair with other nations. He mentions specifically Russia and China as being victims of U.S. bullying, though he does not use that term specifically. What both of these highly educated men demonstrate is that one can gain tremendous academic acclaim and still completely misunderstand the most fundamental tenets of global relationships that underpin almost all international interactions. World history can be looked at from a distance as a simple struggle between good and evil, between right and wrong, order and chaos, light and dark. Throughout history, nations have arisen that have been brutal, dictatorial, and abusive of their own people and the populations of other nations that they have conquered. Gradually, over the long course of time, nations have become more civilized in their dealings with each other. A microcosm of this general trend can be seen inside of the United States as an example. The United States started out as a sparsely populated continent. As the population of the United States increased, and as more and more people lived in tighter and tighter spaces, laws and rules were enacted that governed behavior. These rules of conduct have evolved to keep up with the changing nature of the conflicts that happen when people come into close contact with each other. At the end of World War II, the United States was the only superpower. Directly because of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States offered to protect any nation that aligned itself with the United States against the Soviet Union. As a result, the world has experienced a 75-year period of peace and prosperity that is unequaled in human history. This is now changing for many reasons. We must never forget that just like people, nations are driven by goals and desires that can place one nation at odds with another nation. Without rules by which nations interact with each other, wars will flare up, endangering vast populations. The tide of international relations is shifting from an ever-increasing globalism to regionalism and nationalism. Economically, globalism no longer makes sense to the United States if the United States has to carry the burden of keeping the world's oceans open. The United States is no longer dependent on sea lanes to survive or to thrive. The world is not a safe place for either people or for nations. Only strong people and strong nations survive. Over the last 4,000 years, Western culture has been predicated on a fundamental set of moral principles that have contributed to a generally accepted moral model for the interaction of people and nations with each other. In the Western world, that moral compass is the Christian Bible and the Jewish Torah. The Bible and the Torah both frame all human interactions in the context of good versus evil. Just like people, there are nations in the world today that represent all extremes of the range of good and evil. At one end of the spectrum, you have nations like Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China, which have governments that are based on authoritarian models, whether communist or theocratic in their foundational tenets. At the other end of the spectrum, you have countries like the democracies of the Western world, and I would include Japan and Taiwan in that list. These countries are based on the rule of law and the respect for private property, along with the acknowledgement of various fundamental rights and liberties for their citizens. While it is true that one can find examples of both admirable and reprehensible practices by any of the governments on the spectrum, it is generally undeniable that one set of governments are better at organizing their populations and enabling them to achieve individually determined life goals. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so to speak. National governments have purposes, such as to protect the population from outside dangers, to protect citizens from harming each other, to provide a level playing field for commerce, to provide education and infrastructure, and generally to enable prosperity. These are just a few of the purposes of a national government. Nations compete with each other just like businesses do. They compete for global resources and global markets, and they compete ideologically in the global market for dominance in all spheres. The United States and the Western world is engaged in an ideological and economic war with both China and Russia, along with Iran and North Korea and some others. This war is not currently being fought with kinetic weapons, but that could easily change due to the tremendous economic impact of how the war could turn out. Now, do not misunderstand. I am not saying that the Western world needs to diminish or dominate other nations to prosper and grow. This is not a zero-sum game where one country can only grow at the expense of another. This is a competition where all players could grow and the pie could get bigger for everyone. But that is not the current situation. It is undeniable that democracy and capitalism have proven to be the better model for organizing human governments. One can simply look across the global landscape and see that the democracies are better at elevating people out of poverty and improving their lifestyles. No contest. If competition for ideological dominance were removed from the field and all nations agreed that democratic governments and capitalistic economic systems were the most efficient way to organize and manage people and resources, then there would be no end to what could be accomplished. If some magic fairy dust could be found that would change the mindsets and the motivations of the Communist Chinese Party and the autocrats and plutocrats in Russia, then Western capital would rapidly flow into those countries, and the ensuing economic miracle would be impressive. That vision would require that both Russia and China change their governments from autocratic to democratic. Would there be challenges and abuses and failures? Yes. Would there be a need for governments to monitor and audit the capitalists and make sure that they play by a set of rules that ensure open markets and competition? Yes. These are the purposes of governments. Now, I do not mean to sound like some naive child. I know that this change is not very likely. This was, however, the fleeting hope of the West after the fall of the Soviet Union, but Putin sold off the state-owned industries to his political cronies and supporters, not to the highest bidders. If Putin had sold these industries to the true highest bidders, he would have raised a lot more capital for the new Russian Federation and government that he was heading. The resulting loss of capital to Russia, along with the corruption that was cemented into the system, is the direct cause of the failure of the Russian economic system. I do not naively look for China's Communist Party to give up control, at least not anytime soon. However, the day is coming when their power will decline. It is in the cards, it is undeniable, it is unavoidable. The Chinese Communist Party does not have a choice. Change is coming. The only question is whether the CCP will go out with a whimper or with a bang. The Western world needs to make sure that the cost to the CCP of acting out and using force during their decline is a cost that they cannot afford to pay. Firmness and conviction and determination on the behalf of the West will be required. It is time to revisit the words of President George W. Bush. It is time to redefine the axis of evil. Let's call it what it is and acknowledge that China leads it. The axis of evil includes North Korea, Iran, and Russia. These are all nations that want to overthrow democracy and the Western economic system. We are at war. We have been for a long time. It is time to align our economic policy with that reality. We can win this war. We have the economic power. We have the military power. We can win this war without using the military if we're smart in how we proceed. We have the economic power to win without our military ever firing a shot. In my next video, I will share the range of economic policies that we have available to use. Please be sure to subscribe. Thank you.